up to about age 6.
Sorry, I forgot to do that.
That's okay. I meant to remind you. I'm sorry. I also am hoping that you can come away with this understanding the ways that you, as parents and caregivers, are naturally assisting your child in learning their speech and language skills, and also how that's being facilitated in your child's Montessori classroom. We also want to talk a little bit about some of those things you want to be on the lookout for. So any atypical speech and language patterns and ways that you can help your child at home if you're noticing some of these things. And then finally, if you do have any concerns about your child, I want to just leave you with an understanding of the options that you have if you think that you might need some additional support for your child. So the first portion of this is going to be a little bit of a crash course in speech and language development. Please don't feel like you have to memorize everything. It's just for your own information. Ooh, there we go. So I keep referring to speech and language, and that is because there really is a difference between the two. So when we talk about speech, we're talking about the sounds that we're making in order to produce words. And this includes articulation, so speech sounds, our voice, the sound coming out of our between our vocal folds, and then and out through our oral cavity and nasal cavity, and then also fluency, how smoothly we're able to speak. And then language is really just how we put those sounds together to make words that have meaning and can kind of convey a message. So I like to kind of give you this idea of speech. If it was a computer, speech is the hardware portion. It's those nuts and bolts and all the pieces that you put together. And then the language is the software. It's how we process messages and how we create messages to send out to the world. And so language is going to include things like vocabulary, grammar, how we structure our sentences, and pragmatic language, which is also called social language, how we relate to one another using the language that we have. So we're going to start by talking about speech, because this is the first thing that we really notice children developing. Even as they're first born, they are making sounds, right? Your little tiny infant that you bring home is, doing some sort of reflexive sounds. They're making these oohs and ahs and a lot of cooing early on. Those would be considered vowel sounds because our vowels are open sounds, but they don't really have a lot of control over them at that point. And you also might hear a lot of non-speech sounds, raspberry blowing, and just different little sounds that they make with their mouth that we wouldn't necessarily think of as speech sounds. As they get a little bit older and they gain a little bit more control of their vocal mechanism, you'll start to notice the babbling phase starts. And I like to point out that the range of babbling starting is about 7 to 12 months, but it continues long past that because your child will start babbling, then get some words, but also continue babbling. And so it becomes a sort of mixed code that they're using as they're learning to speak. So we have canonical babbling, which is that, that very typical ba, 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 ma, 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 those repetitive sounds. And then you start to get into, as they get a little bit older, what we call variegated babbling, which is different sounds, different syllables going together, ba, da, ga, 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 things like that, where they're just creating these imaginary words that might actually mean something for them, but they're just trying to communicate with you and practice those sounds. And then around that first birthday, between 12 to 14 months, they finally have enough control to perhaps form their first earliest words. These are usually very simple, and they're still continuing to refine those first sounds that they're developing at this time. So I did include this chart. This is something I gave to the teachers yesterday. It's really helpful to know that we don't develop all of our speech sounds at the same time, and also that these sounds are developed over a range of time. So this chart shows you in years across the top the expected range for the age of mastery for each of the speech sounds that we produce in English. So you'll notice at the left you have your P, your M, your H, your N, your W, and your B. These are our earliest sounds that children often develop because if you think about where you're saying these sounds, they're all produced in the front of your mouth. They're really easy for your children to see when you're talking to them. Papa, mama. baby. All these sounds are produced right here in the front, and it's so easy for them to imitate that. So by the time they are about 3, we would expect those particular consonants to be what we would call mastered. They've got a pretty good handle on them. You notice as you move down the list, K, G, D, T, NG is that ng sound. It's a nasal sound. That some children aren't even going to perfect those sounds until they're almost 4 years old. And it gets even longer as you go further down the list and the sounds become a little bit more challenging and require a little bit more refinement and fine tuning. So a lot of times, we have families that worry about that S sound. My child has a lisp. They're saying their S wrong. And if you look down that list at S, the age range for mastery is anywhere from 3 years old. Some of our 3-year-olds have it, all the way up to 8 and beyond. So it could take your child into elementary school to really perfect their S sound. So this is just a fun little, infographic I like to share so that parents don't worry too much if they say, oh my goodness, they're not saying their THs yet. And you look down and you're like, well, most kids don't get that until about 4.5 at the very earliest. So something to put everyone's mind at ease as you're thinking about your child's speech. So I included just a couple of videos tonight. This is just an example of a child who's about 11 months old, and we're going to hear just a little bit of babbling. She does a little bit of, actually, she's working on a little bit of those T sounds and a little bit of that K sound. Not super refined at this point, but her vowels are really strong. And we do expect by that first birthday that our vowels are in place. So this is actually my daughter. Years ago, when she was about 11 months old, her name is Eiley. So she's really able to produce the I vowel and the E vowel. The L in the middle of Eiley, she doesn't yet produce because that's a much later developing sound. But this is about the time she started saying her first words. And so I'm just going to give you a little listen to this.
Who's this? Who's that? You want to play with it? Who's in the picture? Can you look at it? Who is it? Who's that? Eiley. Who's in the mirror? Eiley. Good girl.
So this video is nice for 2 reasons. I chose it. She doesn't do a ton of babbling here, so you don't get a real good sense of like the babbling that happens at this stage. But I thought it was interesting to note that, she was really mastering those vowels at that point. And it's also a really good example of receptive language, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But I'm asking a who question. And at 11 months old, she knows what that question means. Took her a little while to answer because she was more interested in the picture frame, but that's a nice example for as we talk a little bit more in the language area of what receptive language looks like at this age.
Who's this?
Oops, sorry. There we go. So there's 2 other parts of speech development that I'm going to go over just really quickly because we don't tend to see a lot of issues in this area in young children. So the first is fluency, and then I'll talk a little bit about voice. So fluency, again, it's that how smoothly you are speaking as you're expressing yourself verbally. And so when someone is disfluent, we often call that stuttering or stammering. So children from about the age of 18 months to 7 years actually go through many periods of disfluency, and that is completely normal. They are learning so much so quickly at this point that as they're forming these thoughts in their heads and then trying to control that speech mechanism to put these sounds together to make those words they've been thinking of, it sometimes trips them up and their brain is just working too quickly for their mouth and they can't quite get everything out all at once. So the things that are really normal for disfluencies at this age, from about 18 months to 3 years, you're going to hear repetitions of lots of things. You'll hear a child say the same sound over a few times, maybe even a syllable in a word. So if the word is baby, they might say baby. whole words. Mom, 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 I want to go. That's okay at that point. As they get to about 3 years old, you would not expect to hear them repeating those individual sounds or syllables in a multi-syllable word. So if you are hearing that after 3 years, you're going to want to keep an eye on it and just keep attuned to it. It could just be lingering. But what you will hear from 3 to about 7 years is repetitions of whole words or whole phrases. Can you put your shoes on? But I want to go to the store, or something like that. It's more phrase repetition than sounds. Again, sounds would be much more like a but. And then they use a lot of filler words. So after 3, you're going to hear a lot of and this is them just buying time as they're getting that language, that message pulled together and ready to come out for you to hear. And then the other thing that we're just going to gloss over quickly is voice and resonance. So voice is the quality of how your vocal folds are vibrating together, and that's where your voice is made, is in your larynx. So if your child's voice is hoarse or raspy or breathy, you'll want to keep an eye on those things, but children will naturally go through periods of playing with their voice a little bit. You might want to encourage them not to do a lot of growling if you notice that they're hoarse a lot afterwards. But typically a child's voice is just very high, and because they have these tiny little vocal folds, and then as they get older and their larynx grows larger and it descends in their throat, you'll notice their voice starts to deepen a little bit. So that's why we have these sweet little toddler voices, and they're high pitched and so cute. And then as they get a little bit older and closer to elementary, they start to develop a more mature sounding voice. Resonance is the quality of the voice as it travels through the throat, through the mouth, and through the nose. And really what we're talking about when we think of resonance is, are they hyponasal? Does it sound like their nose is stuffed all the time? Or are they hypernasal? Hypernasal is where there's more air coming through the nose than there should be. And usually if you are noticing something like that, there's going to be some kind of medical reason for it. It's not usually anything too serious. Your child might have some enlarged adenoids or tonsils if they're always sounding stuffy, or if you're a parent of a child who has a cleft palate, you might notice some hypernasality. So now we're going to jump over into language. That was the speech side, the nuts and bolts, how we make our sounds. Now we're going to talk about how we use those sounds to express ourselves. So we have 2 types of language, expressive and receptive. And expressive language is how we deliver the messages that we want to give to others in our world. And receptive language is the ability to process the messages being given to us by others. And it's really the most typical pattern that we see is that young children will most often understand more language than they can express. So you might notice your child can follow lots of directions, but they might not be able to tell you what they're doing as they do it. And that is a very typical pattern of development. So receptive language, because it's our first to develop, we're going to cover this first. Receptive language is when a child is listening in and processing what they hear and then responding to it. So around the time of 7 months, that's around when we notice children are really starting to tune in. If they hear their voice even across the room, they've noticed, they're going to pay attention. And then they are able to identify objects in their environment. If you say the name of something, they're going to look at it. If you're looking at a book together and you say the name of something on the page, they should, and it's a word that they've been exposed to before, they're going to, attend to it with you. There's a lot of joint attention that goes on at this age. They might also, if they're mobile at this point, respond to requests like, come here. They know what that means. They're going to come over to you. They might not be able to say, I'm coming, but they're going to understand what you want from them and they're going to do it. After about the first year, you're going to be able to give them slightly more complex commands like roll the ball. Well, now it's not just the child doing something, they have to actually manipulate an object. They can use gestures and point to things when you name them. So it's not even just looking at it, they're actually going to, oh yeah, I see the cloud. They're going to point to it with you. This is a really good age if you have a child who seems to really understand a lot of words and isn't yet talking a lot. It's a great age to use sign language with them, really simple signs. That can be helpful in allowing a child to convey their message early on and express themselves even before they're able to produce the sounds of the words that they want to say. And then they can also respond to really simple questions at that point. Where is your shoe? You saw in that video that I showed you just a moment ago, I said, who is this? Who is a very simple WH question. Where is a simple WH question. What? They're not yet going to be able to answer why or how. Those are too complex, but very simple questions. They should be able to respond with 1 or 2 words. And then at 2 to 4 years old, you're going to be able to give them more complex directions. So your 2-year-old at home, you should be able to start giving a 2-step direction if you give it time. And then as they get a little bit older and closer to that 4-year range, you can give the 2 steps at once. So for a 2-year-old, they should be able to follow a direction like, get your shoes. And then as they're getting their shoes, you can say, and put, grab your, get your shoes and bring me your coat. And they should be able to do both of those things. Maybe not if you gave it all at once, but then by the time they're about 4, you should be able to say, go get your shoes and bring me your coat. And they should be able to follow that direction with mostly ease. And then they also answer those simple questions, including at this point, why? And also when, although please know that time is an abstract concept for kids at this age. So when might be a little tricky for them. They're going to confuse yesterday and today and last night, and they're going to say tomorrow and mean yesterday. So that's okay. They understand, however, that when is referring to time. And then by 5 years old and beyond, this is when you should really be able to give those really complex directions. You can give them 3-step directions. You can give directions out of order. So at this point, you should be able to say, before you brush your teeth, put your clothes in the laundry. I gave the direction in one order, but I really wanted that last thing to be done first. Before you do this, do this. That's really confusing to a very young child, but by 5, you should be able to start giving those complex directions. This is the age where they also start to pay attention to stories, really get involved in what's happening, make guesses about what's going on, and also be able to answer questions after they've heard the story. And they do understand most of what is said to them. As I was saying to the teachers yesterday, this is the age when you get to 5 where you might think they're not listening, but they are, and they probably understand most of what you're talking about. So here's just another quick little video of Eiley hiding under her favorite little toy there, but she is demonstrating in this video the receptive language skill of playing a game, a reciprocal game. Again, she's only 10 months old in this video, so she can't answer me. When I ask her a question, I'm going to ask her, where's the baby? And she turns it into this almost like peekaboo game, which is something children at this age really love. They love that turn taking and that back and forth. So I'm going to just play this for you quickly.
Where's the baby? Where's the baby? There she is. Where's the baby? There she is. Where's the baby? There she is.
And we'll pause it there because she would go on and play that forever. But that's an example right there. It seems like it's just this fun little thing that you're doing with your child, but they're gaining something from that. They're learning turn taking. They're learning how to, respond. She can't say to me, I'm right here, but she can look up and pay attention to me and make eye contact. And that is a form of communication, letting me know that she is responding to my question.
Where's the baby?
Sorry about that. Every time I hit the next slide, it plays again. All right, and so we're going to talk real quickly about expressive language. This is how a child learns to now use the sounds they've created to send a message to us as the people in their environment. And so again, we talked about how early on, that 7 months to 1 year period, they're doing a lot of babbling, they're pointing at things. A child who wants to be picked up is gonna reach their arms up and grab, up, up. And by their first birthday, 12 to 14 months, we say, they should have 1 or 2 words that they can say. And again, they're usually words that have some kind of sound that's made in the front of your mouth. That's gonna be the easiest for them to start with. Around 1 to 2 years between that first and second birthday, we have what's called a language explosion. This is the point at which children are learning new words daily. You'll be amazed at how many words they learn in just a few short weeks. And so they also, by the end of that 2-year period, are starting to put 1 and 2 words together to make very, very simple sentences, and even asking simple 1 or 2 word questions like, where kitty? They're not going to fill in all those articles and auxiliary verbs, but they can still get their message across. Then from 2 to 4 years, your child should really have a word for almost everything that they're familiar with in their environment. They can talk about home. They can talk to you about school. They might not answer your questions about school. That's normal, but it's not because they can't talk about it. They should be able to talk about maybe a friend that they have, and they should be able to start using sentences with 4 or more words. And again, this is an age range from 2 to 4 years. So if your 2-year-old is not putting 4 words together, that is okay. What we expect is that over the course of that second year to that 4th year, so 2 to 4 years old, you'll start to see their vocabulary growing and their ability to talk about different events throughout their day and to put more and more words together. And then by 5 years old, they're able to tell us stories in sequence. They're very simple stories. It might have a very, very easy beginning and end. It might not even have a middle yet, but they can tell us simple stories. And then they're able to communicate easily with the adults and peers in their environment. And this is when you start to see much more complex sentence structures. So before I go to bed, I brush my teeth. Those different clauses that we have where you're embedding different parts of speech and different syntax into their sentences. They're starting to do all those things very, very naturally. And we're going to leave this big, long talk about development behind in a moment. But I did want to just offer up a quick note on bilingualism. As Susan was saying at the beginning of our talk, there are many families in your community that have perhaps 2 or even 3 or more languages being spoken. And so the children are being exposed to multiple languages. And this is really a gift if you are able to allow your child to learn more than 1 language at once. It's really a wonderful thing. Children who have an equal exposure to different languages are capable of learning them. And there's no evidence to suggest that there's any risk of causing a delay or any kind of language disorder. It really only offers up mental flexibility and the ability to think very analytically, especially when they have more language to describe the things that they want to convey. The one thing to note, though, is if you do have a child that you are raising as bilingual or multilingual, there are going to be some developmental differences. Again, not problems at all, just things that you're going to notice that would be typical for their development versus that of a monolingual speaker. So you'll notice a bilingual or multilingual child would do a lot of code mixing, and that's using both languages at the same time. So a sentence might be half in Spanish and half in English. Or 90% of the words were in one language and they had like 3 words at the end, and that's okay. That's completely normal. And as adults, we actually do that a lot ourselves. If you are someone who has 2 languages, you might notice you'll start saying something and you don't quite have this one word in the language you started out in, so you're going to offer it in the other language and then go back to what you were saying. So that's pretty normal, and when children hear that, they do it themselves. The other thing that is common for bilingual children is that adults tend to think and feel like they perceive that the children have a more limited vocabulary. But what we have found, and I've read some research on this, is that monolingual children and bilingual, multilingual children really have the same vocabulary expectations. They should really have the same number of words at the same time. But in a monolingual speaker, they're only going to be in one language. So it's going to sound like they have a lot more words to say. Whereas in a bilingual child, they have two languages they're working with. So if the monolingual child has 100 words in English, and you have a child who speaks Spanish and English, they're still going to have 100 words, but it might be 55 in one language and 45 in the other. So the expectation is that they'll have the same number of words, but it might look more limited until they start to develop both languages more equally, and have time to develop all that vocabulary. And so if you are a family who is interested in promoting bilingualism, the big thing that you want to keep in mind is you want to have as equal exposure as you can to both of the languages. And the earlier you start, the better, really. Children are born with the ability to make any speech sound in the world. You could be born in one part of the world, and if your parents whisked you away to another continent, you would speak like a native of that continent, because our ears are born with the ability to tune into every speech sound, and our speech mechanism can make any speech sound. So earlier is better for children who are that you would like to be bilingual, because they're able to produce all those sounds very easily. And the other question that often gets asked by families is, should they use a one person, one language approach, which would be one person in the family only speaks one specific language to the child, and everybody else can speak, the other language, whatever other languages are available, but one person is always that person to speak this other language. The other option or arrangement that people have had is the whole home speaks one language that's different from perhaps the greater community, and the child is exposed to a second language when they're away from home. There's no evidence to show that one of these approaches is better than the other. It really just has to do with the equivalency of exposure. So if you find that a child will have more exposure to a second language if everyone at home speaks it, and then they get the language of the community when they're out at school and things, then that's great. If you find that it works better for your family, or only one person in your family speaks a second language, then that's okay too. It's all about the amount of exposure that the child is given. So now for all the things that are happening at your home and in your child's classroom that are helping to promote all of this development that we've just talked about and learned so much about. So at home, let's start. I arranged this so it talks about mostly what you're doing at home, and then some examples of the way that these things are also being fostered in your child's classroom. So building vocabulary, learning those words, those individual words to name things, to talk about actions and activities. The way that children learn is by hearing through models. So the first thing you can do at home is talk, talk, talk. Just keep talking to your child. Involve them in your daily activities. If you are doing the laundry, or going to the laundromat, or you're cooking dinner, talk to them about what you're doing. Show them the things that you have in your hand. Give them names for different things, colors, objects, measuring cups, things like that. Anything that's in their environment. The more you name things, the more quickly their vocabulary will expand, and they'll be able to understand and identify and talk to you about the things that are in their environment. Don't forget to talk about emotions and feelings. Those are slightly more abstract, but you can point to facial expressions as you're talking about these things. Giving them language to talk about how they feel is really, really important and empowering for a very young child. And you'll notice if you talk to your children's teachers at school, we do offer them big words sometimes, like, your face looks upset right now. I noticed your friend took your toy. Are you feeling frustrated with him? Frustrated is a big word. If more people could say, I'm frustrated right now, we might get along a little bit better. And so it's okay to give them big words for the feelings that they have. The other things that we're doing at school to help your child as they're developing their vocabulary, one of the things we do in Montessori is we give 3-period lessons. And I'm not sure how much you've been able to observe in a classroom, but the first period of a lesson is just naming the objects or the materials themselves, giving the children vocabulary. So if we're doing a tonging work, we would point, as a teacher, we would point to the tongs and say, tongs. Or we might point to the geometric solids, and we're going to name each of the solids. Sphere, cube. We're giving them this really big vocabulary, and that's all built into the lessons that we provide. The other things that we do that you can also do at home: sorting, grading. So sorting objects that are alike, grading things from biggest to smallest. You know, when children love to go into the kitchen with you and cook with you, or play with pots and pans while you're cooking, you can give them the measuring cups, have them stack them in order from, you know, largest to smallest. Those are all really great ways for them to gain vocabulary, because you're also offering them the words biggest, smallest, medium. Again, all just ways to build their language, and then sequencing tasks. So doing things in order. At school, we have a lot of sequencing works. At home, you could be talking about the steps to washing the dishes, or the steps to, you know, cooking pasta, something simple like that that they can be involved with. So then we're going to move into how we model correct speech and language. And this one I do sometimes feel is really tricky for parents, because our children do say the most adorable things, and it can be hard sometimes to want to correct them when you just think it's the cutest thing ever. And it's okay to let it go for a little bit. I'm not telling you you have to tell your child to speak like a perfect little adult right away. But as your children get older, and if you notice that they're making errors, there are things you can do to help them. So one of the things we talk a lot about is recasting, which is the process of hearing what your child has said, and, you know, noticing maybe there was an error in it, and then just repeating it back to them in a very natural and conversational way. So the child that says, "I go to school today," they don't have that irregular past tense went, right? I go, I goed. That's great. They've overgeneralized that you put ed at the end of a word to say you've already done it. All you do, you don't have to correct them and say, "Oh no, we say went." You can just say, "Yes, you went to school today. Did you have fun?" And the more we model that and recast our children's messages, they feel validated, they feel heard, and they're also given that model of how to correct that thing that they've said. As they get older, we can model language that's increasingly complex. So your child who's only putting two words together, sometimes you might speak to them in that sort of telescopic speech. You don't want to do it too much, because you do want to continue modeling all those other things that they need to learn. But then again, as we talked about, you know, going from very simple directions, simple tasks, then moving on to talking about things in reverse order, or adding adjectives, or adding prepositions, up, down, on, over. As your child is able to understand more, you can add these sorts of vocabulary words in. And then at school, we're doing all of those things as well. The thing that we do here that I really love as far as pragmatic and social language goes is the grace and courtesy lessons that are built into our curriculum. These are wonderful ways to teach children how to use language to build, maintain, and to repair relationships, because at the end of the day, language is about communication and connection. And so we want to be able to teach the children how to do that right here in the classroom with their peers. And I'm sure you do many of these things at home as well. Things like, you know, can you say please? We say please when we ask for something, you know, or how to interrupt politely. Those are the lessons we give here. A lot of times at home, if you have multiple children, you might be giving those lessons to your children at the same time. But if you have an only child, you know, they might only be practicing that with you as an adult. And so at school, they're given the opportunity to practice that with peers and children that don't necessarily live in the same home with them. At school, we also do a lot of finger plays and poetry to give them an exposure to a lot of language. We read many, many books, and this is true at home as well. I'm hoping that you're all doing story time. Reading is just such a wonderful opportunity to share language with your children. And then at school, we also do a lot of oral language activities, teaching them how to tell a story. I'm not sure if any of your children have ever brought home a little piece of paper with a picture that's on it that's either been cut out from a magazine, or, you know, something that they've seen in the classroom that they put on there, and then they've dictated to their teacher a sentence. So the teacher might have even written it out, but it's teaching the children how to describe what they've seen, and then eventually work up to telling stories and writing their stories down. And the other really lovely thing about the Montessori classroom is that, you know, you've chosen a place for your children that's mixed age. So we're not ever going to expect each child to be performing at the exact same level as everyone else. They're all in this sort of mixture of, some children have a lot of vocabulary right now, and some are just still learning the words, and some can follow lots of steps in their directions, and other children might need a little more help. And so no one ever really feels singled out or different, because they're all learning at a different, at a different level at the same time. When it comes to speech sounds and articulation, the things you can do at home are to talk about the sounds you hear in words, and even model the sounds in isolation. So if you feel like you have a child who is not quite saying the sounds that they need to, that if you looked at that chart at the beginning, maybe a sound that they should have pretty early on, you can make that sound all by itself and just practice it with them. It doesn't have to be like drilling or anything like that, but you can just turn it into a game. Oh, that's the sound at the beginning of pig. Let me say that a bunch of times, and see if they play along with you. Phonemic awareness games, that's just talking about words. Oh, I see the word cat over there. Let's listen to that. What's the first sound you hear in the word cat? And we're not talking about letters at this point. We're just talking about sounds. So when they say k, yes, that's great. Yeah, I hear k at the beginning of cat. Those are really wonderful ways to tune children in to the different sounds that we make when we're speaking. And at school, this is exactly what we do when we teach children their letter sounds and how to read. It's all isolation of single sounds, and we actually work on them a lot before we move into letters. So we do a lot of phonemic awareness activities, and then move into things like the sandpaper letters and the movable alphabet. And then the final thing is metalinguistic skills. So metalinguistics is just a fancy way of saying talking about language. When we do story time, we will talk to the children about how a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. When you're reading at home, especially with your child in your lap or you're right next to each other, a really great thing you can do without saying anything about it is just point to each word as you read it. This starts to tune the children into the idea that our language is broken into different words. And you can even point out punctuation as they get a little bit older. This is going to help them with their reading skills later. And then you can do oral language activities like we do in the classroom as well, coming up with items in a category. What's the opposite of something? Or counting syllables. Children love to count syllables. They love clapping along, especially if you do their name first. Say the child's name first and then count the syllables. They're hooked. They're going to go around, and everyone in your house, they're going to be clapping the syllables in their name. And it's a really fun way for them to just get involved in thinking about how our words are built and put together. So those are all the ways that you're doing speech and language at home already. I'm sure there's much more that you're doing, the things that we're doing in the classroom. This is a list of concerns that parents and teachers sometimes have about the different categories of development that we've talked about. So I'm gonna just kind of glance through this really quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I want to leave some time for questions. But when you have questions about a child's articulation, the things that you can do are just make sure that you're really emphasizing the sounds that you think they might not have. You can play games where you're looking in a mirror and trying to get your child to copy you. And then you can be practicing during conversations. I wouldn't make it the focus of every conversation you have with your child because you don't want them to get frustrated by talking, but you can practice sounds. Oh, I noticed that's that sound we talked about the other day. Let's try it together. Just a couple of times and then move on. Fluency, that's that smoothness of your speech. If you are noticing that you're an older child beyond the age of 3, maybe they're 4, 5, 6, if they're really doing a lot of repetitions of single sounds or single syllables, then you really want to back off a little bit and give your child time to speak. It can be really hard to give a child time to speak when they're having trouble getting their message out, but that's going to be the most important thing you do for them. You can ask them to take a deep breath if they seem really stuck. And another thing that you want to do is think about what in the environment might be promoting feelings of maybe anxiety or feeling stressed or feeling hurried or worried, and just try to think about ways that you can slow the environment down for your child to help them get their message out more fluidly. Voice and resonance, like I said, this was that the vocal tract, the nasal cavity. If you're hearing things like raspy, hoarse, breathy sound coming out, you want to model using a correct voice. And then if you're noticing a lot of hypo, like stuffy nose, or hyper, everything's coming out of their nose. If you're hearing a lot of that nasality, you might want to check in with your pediatrician just to rule out any possible medical issues like enlarged adenoids or tonsils, or sometimes there are children who have what's called a subcutaneous cleft palate. You don't actually see it. It's not something that's even visible, but it can sometimes cause children to have a little bit of insufficiency in closing off their nasal cavity, so you get a lot of nasal sound. So that's something you just want to check in with your pediatrician about. If your child has fewer than 50 words by age 2, just make sure you're offering other ways to communicate. Give them sign language. Make sure you're doing a lot of naming, describing pictures in the books that you're reading. And again, that talking about everything you're doing, giving them names for everything. Okay, for receptive language, it is a little concerning if we hear a child who's able to express more than they can understand. So you want to check in on that and maybe give them opportunities to practice following directions, give them opportunities to hear directions more than once, and maybe even add some visual cues until they start to get a little bit better with that receptive processing. And the last section here, expressive language, if they're having a lot of errors in their sentence or grammar structure, you want to continue to model, continue to recast, continue to offer children examples of how we speak in a proper syntax for the language that you're using. If a child shows regression of skills that they've had previously, you do want to check in with your pediatrician about that. It could be something like a hearing issue. If they've had a lot of ear infections, sometimes if a child can't hear really well because their ear is filled with fluid, they're going to have a hard time learning because they're not getting that input, they're not getting that model. And then if you have a child who's speaking in chunks of words, what we call gestalts, you might have heard the phrase echolalia before. We don't really use that phrase anymore. Gestalts are, there's kind of a twofold thought on this. They can be really purposeful to help a child express themselves, and it's okay for them to use these things. And they're usually phrases that they've heard before and they repeat over again, and they repeat them often. It's okay for children to use these if it's serving a communication purpose for them, but you do want to keep an eye on it because we want to make sure they're also learning how to make their own spontaneous utterances as well. And then the last thing is if your child doesn't want to speak in certain situations or in certain places, this is called selective mutism. And so what you'd want to do then is just really monitor what it is emotionally that's happening with your child that might be causing them to have any kind of sort of shutdown where they don't want to be speaking. And then you could speak with your pediatrician if you think that there's something that needs to be discussed with them. And so the last thing we're going to talk about here before I open it up to questions, and I appreciate your patience, I know it's a lot of information, but when there are concerns, as a parent, that can be really unsettling. Whether you have concerns or your teacher has concerns, it can be hard to hear that or to feel that. So the thing I like to remind parents of is, first and foremost, always ask questions. Ask your pediatrician questions, ask your teachers questions. As you saw here, I've given this information to the teachers along with some other resources, and they have a lot of information on your children's developmental milestones and the expectations that we have for children. I think that sometimes I actually find that parents have really high expectations for their children that, and we have to kind of remind them, actually, no, they're 3 and we don't expect them to be doing that yet. We don't expect them to be reading chapter books by the time they're 4. And so it's important for parents sometimes to hear that so that you can be at ease. So if you're worried about something, just ask some questions. And then when a teacher observes a concern at school, just the first thing I like to remind parents of is just remember you and your child's teacher are on the same team. So it's hard sometimes to hear when there's a concern, but try really hard not to feel defensive about it. It's okay for that to happen naturally. Parents, I've had to tell parents on many occasions that I've had a concern about something. And the thing that I like to remind parents of is it's okay to not be okay hearing this. Just take a minute, absorb what I've said, and then maybe ask some questions again, but maybe focus on some positives. So if you haven't heard enough about this, maybe ask about your child's strengths. Your teachers love your children. They know the good things that your children are doing as well as the concerns they have. So of course they're going to be able to offer you information about what's going on really well with your child. But then also think about reflecting and responding honestly when a teacher asks you about how your child communicates at home, and when when the child's teacher talks about how that compares to the way that they're communicating at school, because it's really important that we get a whole picture of the child. And then if there are concerns, you should consider speaking with your pediatrician, especially if the teacher has raised these concerns with you. It's really, most of the time I tell parents, it could be nothing. It could be something. We don't really know until you've asked the pediatrician to at least look into it. And then we have answers. It's always nice to have a starting point. And then we know if your child does need a little extra support with something, that's great. We're going to get them exactly what they need, because early intervention is always better. And so we give them the foundation that they need to then move on through their classroom and through their school time with us, with fewer stumbling blocks. So I would also suggest following through on recommendations from the teacher or the pediatrician if they're suggesting just maybe looking into speech and not necessarily concerned about bigger things that they want the pediatrician to look at. There are things that you can do yourself. So if your child is under the age of 3, you can call 311 in New York, and that is an early intervention hotline. And it's just a place that you can call and ask questions, and they can set up an evaluation for your child, just to see if there's anything that they might need for a little bit extra support. And then if your child is over the age of 3, there's a New York City Public Schools website. I gave this link to the teachers yesterday, and there's information on there for how to refer for an evaluation if your child meets the criteria of a preschool student. And again, remember, early intervention, it's designed to set children up for success so that they don't have any future setbacks. And I did provide at the bottom here a milestone checklist that you as parents might really appreciate having. It's just a really quick checklist that you can go through on the National Institute of Health's website, and it's broken down by age. So it gives you the opportunity to check in and see what your child is doing and whether or not they're meeting their milestones. So that's what I have for you this evening. These are all of my references, and this is my contact information. I'd be happy to speak with any of you at any point if there are questions that go beyond this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? You can put them in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask the question. We have a few minutes.
And I will unshare my screen.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
Jessa, thank you so much. That was really informative.
Oh, thank you.
I have a particular, possibly unique question for you. Speaking about the possibility of raising your child bilingual, does any of your advice change if the person speaking the foreign language is non-native? So I am trilingual, but I only speak English natively. So my grammar isn't perfect, my vocabulary isn't perfect, my accent isn't perfect, but I want my child to speak other languages. Am I still helping if I speak to her in other languages, or am I actually making it more difficult for her?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. You should, whatever knowledge you have, it is totally appropriate to share it with your child. And if you think about it, some of your children's teachers might not even be native English speakers. So for a monolingual child, a child who only has one language, they might be hearing English in something that is not a native English speaker's accent, and they're still able to process and use the language. And so it might possibly affect your child's accent, or they might not get the grammar entirely right, but it is hard to be truly bilingual from a young age unless that exposure really is equal amongst the different languages. So most kids do end up, if a parent is stronger in one language or more proficient in one language than the other, they're going to get exposure to the other one. They'll be able to speak it, but they might not necessarily be truly bilingual with correct grammar and syntax and idioms and things like that. And that's okay, because what you've done is you've still set your child up with a foundation. And as they get older and experience that language with other speakers who might be native speakers, they already have all those building blocks in place. So I would say go for it.
Terrific. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, maybe I can make the handouts available in the newsletter, because I think those charts were very helpful. So I know you shared some with me for the teachers. I'll just take a look to see if it would be the same for parents.
Sure, I can provide them as a parent version as well, because I did, change a few things to encompass what parents are doing at home. So I'd be happy to share those with Susan this evening, and she can pass them along to all of you.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming in. Jessa, thank you so much for taking the time out tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. This is wonderful. I enjoyed speaking with you all. I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.